Welcome back to BatFacts. Having a successful run on a title can forever link a writer to that character and can yield stunning results as the audience goes through twists and turns over the months and years that can span a run. Denny O'Neil, Steve Englehart, and most recently Grant Morrison and Scott Snyder have all had runs that shaped the character for that time. But perhaps the most influential Batman writer of the modern era never had a run at all. He had a universe. Checking in at different times and key moments over the decades of storytelling, Frank Miller gave us the character's definitive origin and what many consider the character's most fitting end. And he was just getting started. This episode of BatFacts, we're piecing together a timeline for the Millerverse. Given the designation of Earth 31 of the DC Multiverse, the Dark Knight universe, aka the Millerverse, encompasses all of Frank Miller's work on Batman. Thanks to Grant Morrison's recent Multiversity, Earth 31 is now some sort of drowned-out Waterworld planet, but I digress. Though never given DC's Elseworlds distinction, having all of these events occur separately from the traditional DC universe became a necessity, but it didn't always start that way. Having just revitalized Daredevil at Marvel with their Born Again storyline, Miller and Dave Mazzucchelli were given the mandate to modernize Batman's origin in what would become easily the most influential 4 issues of Batman published since his creation, Batman Year One. For Miller, this would be his sophomore Batman effort, hot off of The Dark Knight Returns, but more on that later, obviously. Published in Batman number 404 to 408 in 1987, following Crisis on Infinite Earths, Miller and Mazzucchelli's Year One walks a tightrope between tradition and innovation, and is just as much, and arguably more, of a Jim Gordon story than a Batman story. Focusing on Gordon, just transferred in from Chicago and getting his first taste of JCPD corruption, iconic and updated Batman origin moments are woven in and out, and the 2 stories converge with Batman and Gordon forming their alliance. The story is grounded and free from any supervillainy, as well as introduces dominatrix Selina Kyle, a thus far unscathed District Attorney Harvey Dent, as well as Miller Creations Detective Arnold Flass and mob boss Carmine Falcone. Batman's origin moments are sparse but impactful, with Miller being careful to respect the previous origins while making his own poetic additions, such as Bruce's encounter with a Raven-esque bat in his study. Instead of merely musing about criminals at his peak moment of inspiration, he's potentially bleeding out, deciding whether he wants to die alone as a failed vigilante, when he summons his faithful butler to begin his new life. Yes, father, I shall become a bat. It would become the template for a new kind of Batman story, and in the years that followed, several others would pick up on the tone, themes, and characters of Year One to tell their own tales of an early Batman, such as Jeff Loeb and Tim Sale's Long Halloween and Dark Victory, Matt Wagner's Monster Men and Mad Monk, and Ed Brubaker's The Man Who Laughs, an updated introduction for the Joker. Year One also became the catalyst for an entire new series, Legends of the Dark Knight, which began in 1989 with the initial concept of telling standalone, early career stories with rotating creative teams. Year One and its resulting tales would go on to heavily influence the approach Christopher Nolan took with his Dark Knight trilogy of films. But before Nolan, director Darren Aronofsky was developing his own film titled Batman Year One, with a script written by Frank Miller himself. Although going off of one of the scripts that leaked, the film concept bore very little resemblance to the comic of the same name, despite having the same author. Heralded by editor Bob Schreck as Batman Year One and a Half, as well as a prequel to The Dark Knight Returns, All-Star Batman and Robin the Boy Wonder is many people's least favorite of Miller's work with Batman, and is the point at which DC continuity and the distinctly different Millerverse separate. Drawn by the incomparable Jim Lee and released in 2005, some 18 years after the release of Year One, All-Star puts the Millerverse spin on the story of Robin's origin, which typically occurs during Batman's second or third year as a crime fighter. While serving the practical purpose of having another character to speak expository dialogue to, it's often been said that Robin's narrative purpose was to smooth out the rough edges of what had become a dark, disturbed lone vigilante. This can attempt to explain the Millerverse Batman's tough love approach, as we're witness to Batman hurling abuse at a young, frightened Dick Grayson in an attempt to frighten him out of grief. This Batman is harsher, less shaven, and more prone to throwing goddamn in front of his name, which, for better or for worse, is this series' biggest legacy. One character that undeniably links this story to Year One is Jim Gordon, and though his role is prominent in Year One, his presence isn't felt in All-Star until a brief appearance 6 issues in. He's shown catching up with old flame and future wife Sarah, while his current wife Barbara has sunken deeper into alcoholism and depression. The focus of his appearance in issue 6, however, is an introduction and a bit of a mystery. During his phone call, we're introduced to his 15-year-old daughter, would-be Batgirl Barbara Gordon. Which of course begs the question, what 15-year-old daughter? She was never mentioned in year 1, and James Jr. was heavily implied to be the Gordons' first child. In regular DC continuity, they've explained this by making Barbara Jim's adoptive niece. But this detail is never mentioned in All-Star. Maybe they couldn't find a graceful way to include it.
This is my adopted daughter, Margot Tenenbaum.
All-Star also presents the confusing notion that Bruce Wayne had been watching Dick Grayson for years, silently observing his progress as an aerialist with the intent to eventually train him to become a crime fighter, or as he puts it, drafted into a holy war. Miller's characterization of Batman and his treatment of Robin were heavily criticized. Miller also took heat for his negative and vacuous portrayals of women in the series, including Vicky Vale, Wonder Woman, and Black Canary. The series also suffered from a sporadic release schedule, which only amplified its uneven pacing. Miller introduces many characters and attempts to juggle many stories, but none move towards paying off at a satisfying rate. For example, Batman spends 2.5 issues of the series driving Robin home the first time. That's more than 20% of the story on one car trip. Speaking of cars, Jim Lee's mammoth 6-page Batcave foldout in issue 4 is a sight to behold, but its vastness seems to contradict the story's time frame. Batman has an extremely advanced Batmobile at this point as well. And when Robin asks what the vehicle is called, Batman answers, the Batmobile, contradicting the charming narration given by Bruce in Dark Knight Returns that implied that Dick named the Batmobile himself.
What is this thing?
Dick called it the Batmobile.
Sir!
Something a kid would say.
All-Star Batman and Robin the Boy Wonder was canceled after the release of issue 10, with an apparent 6 issues left of the intended story left to tell, making that car ride still over 1/8 of the intended story. Because of this, Batman is never given a redemptive upswing, and we're never privy to the positive impact of Robin's introduction that Batman's negativity could have been setting up. Both Miller and Lee have expressed interest in finishing the series, throwing around the new title, Dark Knight Boy Wonder. In piecing together a timeline for the Millerverse, the stories consist primarily of key moments, a lot of firsts and lasts. For the only story that lies somewhere in the middle, and the next entry in the Millerverse timeline, we have to go back to 1994. For the overlooked middle child of the Millerverse, Image Comics' Spawn Batman crossover. We can't talk about this book without talking about its artist, Spawn creator Todd McFarlane, and his notable competitive streak. 2 years prior, in 1992, McFarlane and 6 top Marvel Comics creators set the comics world ablaze when they led a Marvel mutiny to form their own publisher, Image Comics. For more info on this important event in comics history, I recommend the documentaries The Image Revolution by Sequart or the recent So Much Damage. Image was a runaway success, and McFarlane would never return to Marvel. In brokering Image's first crossover with DC, McFarlane swung for the fences, making the Image-published half of the crossover Frank Miller's Return to Batman after 8 years, specifically labeled on the inside front cover as a companion piece to The Dark Knight Returns and featuring a very evocative cover. McFarlane would leave writing and art duties on his smash hit Spawn to future Batman legends Grant Morrison and Greg Capullo, respectively, for 3 issues to focus on providing the art for the Batman crossover. Taking Batman out of Gotham, Frank showed some of his RoboCop credentials by having Batman and Spawn fight robotic cyborg versions of New York's homeless population, culminating with 1994 spoiler! Batman and Spawn teleporting onto the back of a bomb. Then the book ends with Spawn taking a batarang to the face. On the art side of things, McFarlane shines with his moody, hyper-detailed renderings, bold layouts, and shot placement, but at a certain point, just decided to never draw Batman's face again. Granted, lots of Batman artists do this from time to time, but I crunched the numbers, and 3 out of every 4 times, Batman is in silhouette. And once you notice this interesting lighting anomaly, you can't unsee it. Comics media at the time, including Wizard magazine, took shots at the book for going against the typical crossover conventions, with Batman and Spawn bickering and fighting the entire book, even after teaming up for the greater good. The book was a standalone for the Millerverse Batman, but did have lasting repercussions to Spawn's face. McFarlane's second page back on Spawn after returning to the book post-crossover looked like this, with a clever nod to meeting some bozo in black. And Spawn kept this look for years. Official Spawn continuity would later try to say that the aforementioned bozo in black was Harry Houdini of all people. But I think the evidence is pretty clear. Batman and Frank Miller left a lasting mark on Spawn. Announced midway through Dark Knight 3 The Master Race in 2016, Dark Knight Returns: The Last Crusade was a 64-page prestige format prequel co-written by Brian Azzarello and drawn by John Romita Jr. Jason Todd's death was foreshadowed in '86 by The Dark Knight Returns, a couple of years before it would actually come to pass in 1988's A Death in the Family storyline and its accompanying phone-in gimmick. What's revealed in The Last Crusade is just how that Robin costume came to be in the glass case in the Millerverse. We catch up with Batman towards the end of his initial run as a crime fighter, beginning to feel the effects of aging while mentoring an increasingly erratic, violent, and cruel second Robin, mirroring some of the behavior exhibited by the first Robin, Dick Grayson, in All-Star. The story intercuts with a stoic, understated Joker, later shown as a Bowie-esque celebrity, here as more of a subdued Charles Manson type, effortlessly and primarily smilelessly leading a group of inmates to aid in his escape. The news galvanizes Robin to defiant actions that lead to his swift yet unremarkable demise in the story's conclusion. We're also briefly introduced to the Millerverse version of Waylon Jones, aka Killer Croc, who is said to have a skin condition, and Pamela Isley, aka Poison Ivy. Although The Last Crusade most definitely painted a dour picture, its titles seem to be a bit misleading, as the story sets up Batman's final crusade, presumably returning Joker to Arkham where he is seen in Dark Knight Returns, but never shows it. So, the Millerverse started with a bang, weaved in and out of Batman history, encounters, and moments, and saw the Dark Knight through until his retirement and the death of the second Robin. Though, much like this episode, that was only half the story. We're going to leave it there. Stay tuned for part 2 of the Millerverse, where I'll discuss Frank Miller's Dark Knight trilogy, its missing chapter, and its future. Like, subscribe, tell your friends who like Batman, support your local comic shop, and stay tuned for the next BatFacts. Some Bat time, same Bat channel. Thanks for watching.